Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the latest installment of RockCreek at COP26. I'm Caroline Atkinson, Senior Advisor at RockCreek. With all eyes on Glasgow, we're looking beyond the headlines to bring you analysis of what the climate discussions mean for investors and how the decisions from these 2 weeks will shape the future of our planet for years and decades to come. So the Leaders' Summit, of course, is now over and heads of state have headed back home. And we saw a flurry of speeches, pledges, coalitions, and gestures of goodwill. In some of the biggest news, India, the world's third largest carbon emitter, pledged to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2070. Another important goal was that a coalition of more than 90 countries pledged to limit methane emissions by 30% by the end of the decade, this decade. More than 110 countries, including Brazil, pledged to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. The EU and the US led more than 90 countries on the methane emissions reduction plan. Yesterday, the focus of the summit turned from policy to finance. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen announced that the US will help to raise $500 million for green bonds, and other countries, nonprofits, international financial institutions announced proposed funding to help developing countries make the transition away from fossil fuels. The billions pledged are important, but of course they fall far short of the more than 100 billion of investments that will be needed in the 100 trillion, I beg your pardon, of investments that will be needed over the next decade to reach net zero. That figure comes from the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, and RockCreek participates in GFANZ as a signatory to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. That makes us particularly pleased that today we will be joined by Nili Gilbert, the chair of GFANZ's advisory panel. Nili is an investor, co-founder of the Net Zero Plus Investment Collaborative and a global leader in marshalling finance for a carbon neutral future. Nili, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to join you today.
Right. I wanted to ask you how you've seen, you're here at Glasgow, we can see you, see the background there, which is terrific, and you're there in your role as chair of the advisory panel of GFANZ. Can you tell us more about that? I'll spell it out again, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, but I understand that GFANZ is the correct way to refer to it.
Certainly a lot easier to say than always saying Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. That's right. So I sit in the CEO and Principals group, which is the leadership group of GFANZ, chaired by Mark Carney. And then within that, I also chair the advisory panel of scientific and technical experts that advises GFANZ on its standards, making sure that they remain high ambition and high quality. Just to offer further context on the structure of GFANZ, as you just alluded to, Caroline, GFANZ is actually an alliance of alliances. So RockCreek comes in through the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. I come in through my role as chair of the investment committee of the David Rockefeller Fund, which is a member of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. You also have the Net Zero Banking Alliance and other alliances across GFANZ that make it up. What's remarkable is that yesterday we announced that across its membership, GFANZ is now convening around $130 trillion in capital and over 450 members. So the world is rightly asking, what is this? What are these standards? And I really wanted to make sure to call viewers' attention to the progress report that we released yesterday. It's over 100 pages of detail on exactly what we're doing across our 7 work streams and what our forward-looking goals are. It's important to remember that GFANZ was just founded 6 months ago, and a lot of
so you've done a lot already.
Is forward-looking, exactly.
That's terrific. And you've already achieved, well, I read out some of the achievements, and of course, a lot of them, as cynics say, are about pledges and commitments and promises and not necessarily actual action. But what progress have you seen and do you hope to see for the rest of the COP26?
Well, when I think about progress at COP26, of course, it's really exciting to see how the private sector has stepped up. People repeatedly say that this is unprecedented across the history of all COPs. In addition to what I describe about GFANZ, the race to zero, which represents the corporate sector out beyond finance, is now representing over 10,000 members, non-state actors of all kinds. But a big message that we want to bring to COP is that the private sector can't go it alone. We really need our policymakers to step up and support us in our objectives and commitments. And so I also wanted to share a little bit about the policy call to action that GFANZ issued in the wake of the recent G20 meeting, calling for things like G20 governments to set economy-wide net zero targets that focus on things like carbon pricing, sector-specific policies to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, with proceeds going into just transition, demanding standardized net zero transition plans from corporations worldwide, and importantly, aligning sovereign debt and lending with our sustainability goals, including the protection of biodiversity. So those are some of the things beyond what you'll see in the GFANZ work streams that we're looking for here at COP.
That's great. That's fascinating. I have to tell you that I was at the Paris COP with President Obama. I worked for him then, and the G20 ahead of that, where Mark Carney was in a different role at that stage as the chair of more on the financial side. But the work that GFANZ is doing, pulling everything together, is really important. We're used in the public sector is used to saying we can't do it alone, we need the private sector. What you're saying is the private sector is up and running, ready to go this time around, but we do need the right policy environment.
That is exactly
so
what we're saying.
Yeah, you're also stepping into the role of Vice Chairwoman of Carbon Direct. Yeah. Can you tell us more about that step and how it connects to the COP26 agenda?
Sure. So excited to be joining Carbon Direct as vice chair. And in this role, really pleased to reconnect with my friend, Jonathan Goldberg, the founder and CEO of the company, who is truly a great leader in this field. You know, for me, after spending over a year solely focused on technical net zero and scientific pathways through the work that we do in the Asset Owners Alliance and GFANZ, I felt like the science was clear. And so in stepping into my new professional home, it means a lot to me that Carbon Direct was founded to address these climate imperatives and is really aligned with this focus on needing to lean into the net zero transition across hard to abate sectors. Just to tell you a touch about the firm and what we do, you can think of the company as having two sides. And all of our work is supported by a team of 42 senior climate scientists, many of them PhDs. So on one side of the business, you've got Carbon Direct Capital Management, which is already an established brand as a leading financial sponsor, supporting technology companies that are delivering climate solutions. And with all those deals and investments being evaluated by our in-house scientists. The company is making minority investments in growth equity rounds, Series A through D, in companies with technologies that have already achieved commercialization. And we're now raising $1 billion fund to meet the accelerating needs in the carbon management ecosystem. And then on the other side of the business, we're operating a scientific advisory business, also leveraging the expertise of our scientists. This advisory business is supporting Fortune 500 companies, actually mostly Fortune 100 companies, in their own carbon management journeys, companies like Microsoft, Shopify, Alaska Airlines, GlaxoSmithKline. And now we're doing the work to figure out how to take that very high touch work for the world's largest companies and to build it into a product that can really be scaled to support the thousands of companies who will need to be on this journey.
That's terrific. So you're really helping using your scientific expertise and investment expertise to help corporates figure out how to adjust their operations and their supply chains, no doubt, and
Yes.
to get to that goal, which increasingly the private sector has been signing up to, of achieving net zero. And
Yes.
you're actually there trying to help them figure out what those steps are that they need to take.
Yes, and corporations and the world, as you alluded to in your opening question, really want to know that these pathways are real and that they're rooted in serious science. And so the work that Carbon Direct does really reflects that imperative, which is why I'm so proud to be part of the company.
That's great. That's great. You mentioned about being working with the David Rockefeller Fund, and you've also worked with the Hewlett Foundation. So you've been involved in philanthropic exercises and efforts on climate. How do you see the role of philanthropy in climate action? And are there any philanthropic initiatives or leaders that you think are particularly innovative and really likely to make a difference or to help the world to make a difference?
Well, when I think about the role of philanthropy in general and the social contract by which we exist, I actually think about a lot of it as risk capital. And so some of the philanthropic initiatives that I'm most inspired by are those which are willing to put up first loss capital, catalytic capital, to be able to do all of the rest of the work that we need to do across the landscape to achieve the transition. And so some examples of this include blended finance, where we combine different types of capital at different risk levels to be able to fund the much needed transition across developing and emerging market countries. But then also announced here at COP was a pledge between the Earth Fund, the Rockefeller Philanthropies, and IKEA that also is focused on using philanthropic capital as risk capital to provide funding for renewable energy in poor countries. And that's something that is also very inspiring to me, the Global Energy Alliance.
That's terrific, because as you say, there is a lot on our guest that we were discussing, that Afsane Bishlos was discussing these issues with yesterday, was talking very much about risk and the importance for investors of analyzing risk and companies, risk of, in that case, what climate change is already going to come. But the notion of philanthropy as stepping forward to take some of the first loss problems and therefore unlocking capital that can flow from the private sector on with your GFANZ hat on
Exactly.
is an important one. Yeah. I'd like to ask you also, what do you make of all of the government pledges for money? I mean, this has been obviously a contentious issue. The wealthy, richer countries that have been the major polluters up till now, but are now no longer, in most cases, as big polluters as some of the developing countries. So, as I said, the US has said they will support $500 million in green bonds, but GFANZ says we need 100 or 150, you mentioned, trillion dollars. So what do you see as the path forward for really leveraging, obtaining, allocating the sufficient funding to make climate action real across the world?
Well, first of all, I want to say that even as governments step up with these commitments, it needs to be just the beginning. It's not yet enough private sector capital to be able to achieve our long-term goals by 2050, and we need to keep the pressure on. But on the other hand, I want to point out the fact that GFANZ now represents $130 trillion in capital, all committed to net zero transition across the entire capital base by 2050. And so when you compare that to the $100 to $150 trillion number that is estimated to be needed to affect the transition, we feel like we're actually getting there. And this is why we say that the excuse that there's not enough money is out of time. Now, what we're saying to governments is the money is here and we're ready for you to step up and partner with us in getting this done.
So that's to governments that are financing governments. You're saying to them, as well as to philanthropies, please work with us to get that money allocated. You also saying to, let's say, recipient governments or to governments that are trying to make changes, we need the projects, we need the, we need the asks for the finance as well. Is it both sides of that, both the
both
donor
sides.
governments?
I hear people say a lot that they think that the projects aren't there when it comes to transition finance in the global South. And I like to push back on that comment. There are certainly barriers, which I think were spelled out well in the position paper on scaling blended finance that was published from our Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. I encourage people to look at that. But I think at this point, it may be more about removing technical barriers, structural barriers, kind of addressing some of the plumbing and flow issues, thinking about how we're structuring the capital, putting together the deals and projects to then catalyze the flow of more projects. But there's certainly plenty out there that we can do right now.
That's very good to hear. And that's certainly our impression as well. Obviously, there is the issue of how you make those projects truly bankable with
That's right.
for both for all of the private sector institutions, all of the investors that are very interested in moving into this space, but also with the support of governments that want to help because it's one planet and we're all living on it together.
Yes.
Maybe I'd just like to step back a bit and have you think, there you are in Glasgow at the COP26. It's we're just into the first week, I guess, coming to the end of the first week. I'd love to hear your sort of almost personal impressions about what's the most surprising thing that you've learned at COP, and what are you hoping for most from next week?
Not only am I here at COP26, but I also had the chance to be at TED Countdown recently, which was another global climate gathering. And it's the first times in some ways that our community really has the chance to be together in person in a while.
Yeah, that's nice as well.
It's nice, and it's in some ways emotional. People care about this issue with their hearts. They're worried about future generations. They're worried if we're going to be able to figure this out at all. They do not want to live in a 3 or 4 degree world. And so one of the things that has struck me as a person who has been sitting at home on Zoom and my laptop working mostly on science and technical pathways is the nature of the political will and public discourse that we need to have also to be able to advance our net zero ambitions in a serious way. Listen, there can be reasonable disagreements among serious people about how this is going to go. The IPCC puts forward about 150 different pathways to achieve significantly below 2 degrees that are science-based. But I guess I'm also surprised and disappointed that some folks' ambitions don't seem to be rooted in science or long-term strategy. And so I hope that we can find ways to bring together what's in our hearts and our visions and our dreams with the serious pathways that are available to us. And also that we can continue to use technology, innovation, policy changes to make our forward-looking pathways better.
That's terrific. And I of course, join you in that hope. I do think that I'm so glad that you've been able to join us. I want to remind everybody that you are now the chair of the advisory panel of GFANZ and the vice chairwoman of Carbon Direct, that you're a co-founder of the Net Zero Plus Investment Collaborative, and that you've really thrown your heart and soul, but also brain into figuring out how best we can approach these big challenges in the world. And we're really thrilled to have had you here, Nili Gilbert. Thank you.
It's really my pleasure to reconnect with you and RockCreek, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you for all that you and your team are doing on this as well.
Thank you so much.